people tend, on the whole, to live their way into a new way of thinking rather than think their way into a new way of living.
Hi, I'm Glenn from Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. It's our great privilege to have on the channel Rupert Shortt. He is the author of many books, including God is No Thing, The Hardest Problem, and his latest book, which is called The Eclipse of Christianity and Why It Matters. He joins me on the line from London. Hello, Rupert.
Hello.
You have written a book in which one of your opening chapters, I think it's chapter 2, you discuss what have the Christians ever done for us, or what have the Roman Catholics and other Christians ever done for us, obviously playing on the great Monty Python sketch from Life of Brian. What have the Romans ever done for us? What about the roads? Well, of course the roads. The roads go without saying, is a lovely line from John Cleese. Lovely line because there is so much in your culture that goes without saying when it is the air that you breathe, which is the name of a book that I've written that's quite similar on this topic, in which we look at Christian culture and you say to yourself, what has Christianity ever done for us? Well, of course, human rights, they go without saying. Well, of course, charity, it goes without saying. Well, of course, hospitals, they go without saying. Can you give us a little bit of a potted history of what have the Roman Catholics and other Christians ever done for us?
You really put your finger on it. I think the analogy of fish unaware of the waters that they swim in is germane. There's something known as the subtraction thesis, which essentially says, well, we believe in all these goods: democracy, human rights, individualism, science itself. We can purge ourselves of the mumbo jumbo, the belief in the virgin birth and the resurrection. And part of the question, I suppose, is first of all, can we really do that? But secondly, do you not realize where these goods all really came from? Christianity really affected a profound revolution. Jesus represented a transformative moment, perhaps the really decisive moment in the evolution of human consciousness. And it's no accident, among many other points I could make, that Christianity, the faith, spread like wildfire among women and slaves and other marginalized people in particular. It was no part of ancient religious practice, for the most part, to imagine that care of the widow and the orphan, outreach of this kind, was integral to religious practice. You get shades of it in Stoicism, but even Stoicism is quite an aristocratic vision of the world. It's Christianity that is really transformative, of course, drawing on the legacy of Hebrew scripture, but extending it and radicalizing it. That isn't to say for a moment that the church hasn't betrayed its Lord, that there haven't been many false starts and blind alleys and so forth. But if we're talking about the title deeds and the big picture, then Christianity really is transformative.
And I think modern secular people struggle with that idea because it's the water that we swim in. And so the kinds of values that we tend to prize, having had a Christianized history, seem to us obvious, natural, universal, self-evident. And therefore, religious people sound like we are hobbyists off to one side, on the fringes of society, and I guess we could pursue our religious hobby off to one side. But the idea that Christians would have something to say into the public space is often quite a surprise. And I really noticed that with the assisted dying bill and the debates around the assisted dying bill. And people were noticing that a lot of religious people had religious reasons for forwarding their position, let's say in the sanctity of life or something like that. And it was very interesting that, Polly Toynbee in The Guardian would say things like, well, religious people are They're free to have their own private views, but they shouldn't bring it into public discourse. Or Lewis Goodall said, religion has quietly played a dominant role in the debate and distorted the conversation, which it seems quite a strange thing to say, but I think it goes to the point of, because Christianity has done such a good job of instilling in us values like the sanctity of life, it feels like Christianity has done such a good job, it now no longer has a part to play in public discourse, and secular people want Christian voices to have less of a say because we have so shaped the discourse. There's an interesting interesting dialogue there.
Yes, there are a lot of questions to a big cluster of issues there. I think that a lot of secular thought does represent a kind of stripped down theology transposed into a different key. The question, though, to me, granted that we know what we believe, or many secular people know what they believe, the follow-up would be to say, but why do you believe what you believe? And secular humanism doesn't have very secure foundations philosophically, in my view. It presents an imperative to be kind. But when you ask, why we should be kind, tell me, without recourse to metaphysics, why we should be kind, the answers that you get tend to be much hazier. Not that we live in particularly kind times anyway. We live in highly polarized times. So one question would be, what else can Christianity bring to the party? And I was very struck in the course of my researches by a priest in the Church of England who'd been a school teacher all his life, but who got ordained quite late on. And he said that he wanted to emphasize the extent to which his former pupils from Gen Z tend to campaign on specific issues rather than committing themselves to institutions. Some of those issues, he added, LGBT rights, safeguarding, are ones on which some churches have questionable records. But, he added, rights-based campaigning tends towards factionalism and intolerance. The trans rights versus women's rights is an obvious example. At some point, he concluded, I hope, people will come to see the futility of this approach and be open to the attractions of the church, because at its best, it transcends differences of that kind. Quote, love, like death, hath all destroyed, rendered all distinctions void. Names and sects and parties fall. Thou, O Christ, art all in all, as Charles Wesley memorably expresses that thought. So there's one thought for you, that Christianity, as its best, provides resources. It offers tools for helping us navigate. It also, as I have implied, has a much richer diagnosis of the human condition. Christian anthropology is deeper. Again and again, you find, I think, with secularists, an assumption that somehow we're all fine as human beings. We're sort of blank slates. Things only go wrong because of ideology. Religion is a kind of ideology. Remove the ideology and everything will be okay. Christianity has so much more to say about the fracture in human nature, about the both individual and structural faults that are other words for sin, of our need for healing, for redemption. Ultimately, I should make clear, I want to commend the Christian faith because I think it's true. That's to say, I believe that God was man in Palestine and lives today in bread and wine, to cite John Betjeman. But even if you are, let's say, in the twilight zone, let's say you're a Jordan Peterson kind of character and you're dancing a tango on the edge between religion and irreligion, perhaps you will come to see over time that a faith like Christianity is worth taking more seriously because of the great store of wisdom that it represents.
Have you ever thought about how your bank uses your savings? What if I told you there's a fully regulated Christian bank that aligns your money with your faith? When you open a Kingdom Bank savings account, you help to provide vital mortgages for churches, Christian ministries, and gospel workers who might struggle to secure one elsewhere. Whether saving for yourself or on behalf of your church, your savings will support Christian ministries across the UK. And when you're ready to take your money out, you get it back with interest. If your spending and giving reflect your faith, shouldn't your savings as well? Open a savings account with Kingdom Bank today and put your money where your heart is. Visit kingdom.bank/speaklife. Kingdom Bank is a member of the FSCS and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority. We are starting to see people in the orbit of the Jordan Peterson world pay attention to the great store of wisdom within Christendom. I'm thinking of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, interestingly, around about 1 year ago, at a conference that very much orbited around Jordan Peterson and certainly his online influence. There was sort of Philippa Stroud kind of bringing some more of the sort of political heft and more of the UK side of things. But between Philippa Stroud and Jordan Peterson, they put on the ARC conference, at which Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who came out of sort of radical Islam and then went into eventually very much the new atheism, she came out at the ARC conference as a lapsed atheist who slides herself into a pew Sunday by Sunday and is learning a little more about the faith Sunday by Sunday. And she credits a number of different things in her journey. One thing she credits is the marvelous Tom Holland and reading Dominion and seeing the ways in which she is already a fish swimming in some pretty Christian waters. So that really helped her. There are all sorts of geopolitical moves that she mentioned in her article, Why I Am Now a Christian, but also some very raw personal tragedy and personal need. And she seems to have discovered a rich personal faith through prayer and calling out upon Jesus. Do you think Ayaan Hirsi Ali's story is in any way emblematic or hopeful for other people in the secular space finding faith?
Well, my book pivots on a paradox. It's called The Eclipse of Christianity and Why It Matters, as you've said. But I think you need to say on page 1, or very early on at least in a book of this kind, that of course Christianity isn't an eclipse in the world as a whole. It's growing pretty strongly. The exceptions are the Western world, particularly Western Europe. But even in Western Europe, there are signs of regeneration, not least owing to immigration. I mean, a city like London is a much godlier place a quarter of the way into the 21st century than it was 25 years ago at the turn of the millennium. I worked for Times newspapers for most of my career. So another Rupert Murdoch was my ultimate boss. And in the big office, the news building in the centre of London, it was very revealing to see the number of employees there working in catering or cleaning and what have you, who are either Catholics or Muslims or ex-Catholic recruits to evangelicalism or charismatic Christianity. I think somebody like Ayaan, who incidentally, she's done all the things that you said that she's done, but she was also baptized in September of this year alongside her husband the historian Neil Ferguson, and I was privileged, along with Tom Holland, as it happens, to attend that ceremony. I think in her case there is a conservative reaction to what is seen as progressive overreach. Healthy self-criticism in a culture is no doubt a good thing. Self-criticism shading into self-laceration is more questionable, and self-laceration shading into self-hatred can be dangerous. And it may well be, and I think I would be with her on this point, that we have lost so much self-confidence in the West in recent decades that we are now reluctant to take our own side in an argument. If being woke means foregrounding previously neglected voices, then I don't see how a reasonable person could disagree with that. But if it means, for example, saying, I tick A, B, and C identity boxes, therefore I'm right, and you only tick D, and E, and therefore you're wrong, I think there is a good case for saying that's pretty dangerous. And ironically, of course, it is there's more than one irony here, actually. One is that it's precisely that it's inverting Martin Luther King. I mean, it is judging people by what boxes they tick rather than the content of their character. The second enormous irony to the woke revolution is that it has ended up reinscribing a Eurocentric view of the world, because in focusing on all the sins of European imperialists, we have started to overlook awkward truths about many other societies, starting with the fact that almost every human society that has ever reached a certain level of wealth has practiced slavery. And you can, of course, talk about the industrial scale of the Atlantic slave trade. I mean, it involved 14 million people or more, which is 14 million or more too many. But look at a phenomenon like the caste system, which is in India, which has gone on for millennia. Look at the numbers involved in the Arab slave trade, which probably even more than 14 million. I suppose that the point is that we're political campaigners tend to be slaves to fashion, so we see certain things, not others. You know, we are very alive and no doubt rightly alive to the plight of the Palestinians, for example. But we say very, very little about what's happened to the Kurds of Turkey, or indeed about the fact that the first genocide of the 20th century was of Armenian Christians carried out by Ottoman Turks, and as you know, it's now illegal. Has long been illegal, actually, in Turkey to talk about that monstrous crime. So I think, in a nutshell, somebody like Ayaan is wanting to say, don't be so naive or so ignorant as to imagine that all these goods that we take for granted in the Western world are shared elsewhere. I mean, the notion that all are made in the image of God and are of equal worth and dignity is not really shared in other cultures. I mean, one can talk about the great traditions of philanthropy in the Islamic world, and of course there are aspects of the teaching of faiths like Hinduism and Buddhism from which I think Christians can learn, particularly the emphasis given to environmental stewardship. But the belief that all are made in the divine image and belief in political pluralism as a good in itself really are they're the products almost entirely of Judeo-Christianity, and they're worth cherishing. I mean, you will have gathered a big implication of what I'm saying, which is that we're a little bit like Wile E. Coyote. You know, we've rushed off the edge of the cliff, and we're falling fast, and we're saying, you know, so far so good. But of course, the abyss faces us. Now that can be misheard as saying that everything in Christian societies has always gone right and everything in non-Christian societies has gone wrong. You know, I am emphatically not saying that. I mean, just think of the Christian heritage that Russia has had, of the easy accommodation that millions of Germans made with the Third Reich, and you know the list goes on. I am making the, I think, gentler, humbler, more realistic claim that Christianity at its best and its most self-critical really does give the richest toolbox available for a just ordering of society, for sculpting a narrative of what counts, what constitutes human fulfillment in all its dimensions. That's that can't really be equaled elsewhere.
Yes, and you make a good case for that in the book. And what you don't want to do, and what I don't want to do, so my book, The Air We Breathe, is kind of taking a more confessionally Christian angle on the Tom Holland thesis, basically. I've noticed that my book has been picked up in certain quarters and used as a weapon in the culture wars, as a kind of, we need to forward Christian ends in order to have the political outcome that we quite like. And because we like Western liberal values, I've noticed that sometimes people have wanted to use this kind of argument almost cynically as, okay, well, therefore, what we really want is this kind of just political order. Let's use Christianity in order to get that. How do we get heard rightly if people are in danger of mishearing us on this point?
Yes, that's a really good question, because I mean, some people might think that I am going to acquire some unpalatable bedfellows here. There are strands within Christianity that I feel uneasy about. In the Catholic world, it would be integralism, which seems to display theocratic impulses. In the Eastern Orthodox world, you have a sort of ethno-nationalism. Look at Russia, which has got quite a lot in common with some of the more unsavoury strands of Islam, I would say. And of course, you have hardline Protestant fundamentalists in the United States who would like, for example, to see the Ten Commandments enacted in statute. And going back a few decades, you had outfits like the Moral Majority who were very, very close to the right of the Republican Party. So if you said to me, well, perhaps you're just picking and choosing, Rupert, and being a bit too subjective here, I would say it's a question of looking at the classical Christian tradition in all its breadth. You know, I'm not sure that a fundamentalist in the deep south of America is all that connected with the classical tradition extending back to millennia. The resources are much richer than one might think. And for me, a crucial point is that Christianity, it can articulate some of the best impulses found both on the left and on the right. I remember a liberating moment for me was when I heard somebody some time ago saying the left and the right both seem, they're both often correct about what they care about, but they just care about different things. So when the left, for example, worries about the left behinds, about outreach, about severe inequality, the left needs listening to. But when the right worries about balanced budgets, personal responsibility, deferred gratification, then the right needs listening to as well. And in a body of doctrine like Catholic social teaching, I think you have something, particularly rich, which is takes the long view. I mean, for example, it looks about human need across the entire life cycle. It is respectful both of enterprise, entrepreneurship, but also of solidarity and of the importance of maintaining social capital. And it's interesting to me that when somebody like Trump started standing up for the left behinds in the Rust Belt of America in 2016, the one other person on the electoral map who was saying things somewhat like him was Bernie Sanders, namely the most left-wing candidate. And that they were both in their different ways echoing priorities that you find in Catholic social teaching. But this body of teaching, of course, is, as I've indicated, much more sophisticated and much more inclusive than you are likely to find in a tub-thumping partisan politician. And it probably goes without saying, but perhaps I should just say, I am a journalist. I know a thing or two about the corruptions of my trade. And bad news sells newspapers or gets clicks online. An exploding aeroplane, by definition, is news. A volcanic eruption is news. Underground streams supplying irrigation, stability of life, prosperity to vast numbers of people over many generations, that isn't news. I'm in a strange little class of one in I think I'm the only person ever to be a biographer of both a Pope and an Archbishop of Canterbury. And I've written lives of both Rowan Williams and Benedict XVI. And I've had to spend more than my fair share of time in the marble halls of Rome. All seems quite germane this week with the release of this film Conclave, starring Ralph Fiennes. But I have also investigated in detail the global persecution of Christians in my book Christianophobia, and I have had to visit some of the most benighted places on earth in Africa and Asia, the largest slums in the world. And again and again and again, it is Christian outreach. It is the Christian missionaries, it's the religious sisters, it's the friars, the priests who are there alongside the poorest of the poor. And in, often completely unsung ways, Christian-based endeavour is incalculably important. I mean, I think it's been estimated to contribute, well over $1 trillion a year to the American economy, for example, let alone what's going on in the rest of the world.
Yes. So you talk about the social capital of Christianity and the church globally, and therefore that begs the question: what are we staring down if that social capital shrinks? If there is a great de-churching in the States, there have been 40 million Americans who stopped going to church this century. It's the greatest demographic shift in U.S. history. It's the greatest spiritual shift, greater than the Billy Graham Crusades combined with the First and Second Great Awakening, all combined, and it's in the opposite direction. In the UK, perhaps you can sketch out for us like where you think church going is at in a UK setting. What is the state of play for the church in the West right now, and what do you fear might happen if these trends continue?
Well, sorry, maybe I could just round off the answer I've just given, because although I did speak at some length, it perhaps wasn't quite full enough, because notwithstanding the sort of theocratic impulses among some Christians today, and of course examples from the past like the medieval papacy, I do think that there is something about Christianity as such which is or should be conducive to pluralism. Islam is, of course, Islamic societies have flourished. Muslims have done many wonderful things in terms of building up charitable outreach. I think one of the problems of the Islamic world today is that they're feeling bewildered, because for the first half of the Islamic era, Islam was civilizationally ahead of the Christian world. There are complicated reasons for this, one of which is the embrace of Islam by Persia, which was a very advanced civilization. When Spain was invaded by the Moors, it instantly became the most advanced country in Europe because of all the technology that the invaders brought with them. But ultimately, I think one has to be candid about differences between Christianity and Islam. Jesus entered Jerusalem on a donkey with the aim of converting the temple into his spiritual body. And Muhammad stood at the head of an army, arguably calling on it to effect global conquest. So it is an integrated political and religious vision of the world, and I'm not sure that Christianity is. I mean, in some ways, if you wanted to criticize Christianity, you would say, it's not very realistic about the needs of political power. It says, forgive 70 times 7 and turn the other cheek. But given the exceptionally important emphasis on strength in weakness in Christianity, and the idea, if you like, that the incarnation is itself the supreme act of democracy, because Christians worship a God who removed his crown to share our flesh. I think that ought to provide potent means of reaching out to the other, tolerating the other. You'll know the saying that the church is the one organization that exists for the sake of its non-members. Now, I have seen that vision go wrong. Unlike most British Catholics, I grew up in a Catholic country. It wasn't Ireland, even though I am of Irish stock partly. It was Spain, and this was the tail end of the Franco era, where non-Catholics, let alone non-Christians, were forbidden to stage public worship. So it can go wrong, but the resources are there to enable it to go right. And to come closer to a more direct answer to your question now, it's very striking to me that although those who oppose having bishops in the House of Lords in the UK often put their hands on their hips and say, do you know, the only other legislative body on earth which has clerics in it as of right is the Iranian parliament. But unlike the mullahs, the point about these C of E bishops is that they speak up for faith in general. And you'll find that among those most in favour of having bishops in the House of Lords in the UK are Muslims and Hindus. Nevertheless, to cut to the chase, church-going is in steep decline in this country. As I've said, there are exceptions. London has become quite a lot more religious since the turn of the millennium. That's probably true of most large cities. I had to travel, as you can imagine, quite a lot while researching my book. And very often when I would fetch up in such and such a provincial town or city, the taxi driver would be black or Asian. And it was almost always he, would be a Muslim or a Pentecostal of some kind. As you know, Pentecostalism is the Christian counterpart to Islamic revivalism. It's spreading like wildfire. It is also resolutely non-violent, which is one reason why the Western media isn't particularly interested in it, because of this lazy narrative that religion is A, dead in the West, and B, violent in the East, and there's nothing in between. So there's quite a lot going on under the radar. I went to various outer neighbourhoods of London, and if you thought that the centre of Christian life was in the parish church, you'd be very much mistaken. You have to go to the business park on the edge of the area, where you would find, in one particular case, Leighton, which is near Stratford, near the Olympic Stadium. I found not one or two, but three very large Pentecostal congregations. On the other hand, my book is chiefly about there is a chapter on Pentecostalism, but it's chiefly about the decline of traditional institutional Christianity. And there the statistics are melancholy. I have roots in the English countryside, not too far from Cambridge. My parents have been telling me for years that the congregation at their village church has been falling, and the statistics speak for themselves. In the 2001 census in the UK, over 70% of people claimed a Christian allegiance. By 2011, that figure had fallen to 59%, and now it's well below half. The rural church does seem to be dying on its feet, and the church of the future, I think, will look very different. It will be leaner and more committed and poorer, but also, one hopes, humbler and more committed.
As we round out, Rupert, let's talk to a jaded secular person who is warm to what you're saying about what Christianity has offered in the past, who is warm to what you're saying about how fractured we all are. We've mentioned two very significant votes in the last 6 weeks. You know, the vote for Donald Trump reveals all sorts of political, fracturings and new divisions and new ways of cutting up the political pie. In the States, I think the assisted dying bill also revealed lots of different strange alliances. You might think, from one point of view, you might have Diane Abbott and Nigel Farage, on the same side of an issue, and I think there is a fracturing that's going on in post-Christian society. There is something of a meaning crisis. Let's imagine that you're having a fireside chat with someone who is warm to both ideas. They're warm to the idea that Christianity has offered much in the past, that whatever successor ideologies we are attempting in the present aren't particularly doing the job. What is your next bit of advice to such a person about how to pull at those sorts of threads and perhaps find faith at the other end of it?
You put your finger on something really important there, because there are, of course, so many people, especially opinion formers, educators, members of liberal elites, if you will, who will say things like, yes, of course, Christianity has all the grand narratives. It has the memorable rituals. But ultimately, the comforts that it offers are spurious because atheism is true. So I would partly want to ask, really some quite muscular conceptual questions. I mean, far from reaching straight for the language of faith, which may not mean anything much to a lot of people and may indeed strike them as soft-headed, I would say, if you're an atheist, your philosophical worldview is naturalism. That is the corollary of believing that an inventory of reality consists of nothing but the physical world. How reasonable is it to actually say that? If you are a naturalist, you're committed to saying that the world made itself, or the world has always existed. How viable are those propositions? You can't have something unless something else gives. That is science as understood by both Aristotle and by contemporary science. It is not possible, in the terms naturalism allows, to say how anything at all can exist. And therefore, theism is a valid inference of philosophical reasoning, metaphysical reasoning. The trouble with somebody like Richard Dawkins and the spate of new atheist polemics that we've had over the past 20 years is that the argument doesn't really get off the ground, because the God in which a figure like Dawkins disbelieves is an idol, really. It's a sort of science professor up in the sky. His argument seems to be, look, we have this perfectly good explanation of reality in the form of the theory of evolution. Before Darwin, we had Newton unlocking the mysteries of the movement of the planets, and developments in AI now promise to unlock the mysteries of the human brain. It's all going to be sorted out. The mistake there is to see God as one big player on the same chessboard, if you like, as us. Whereas what the classical traditions, Jewish and Islamic and indeed Hindu and Sikh as well as Christian, what they're saying is that God, the relationship between God and material reality is of a different order. And if you want an analogy, well, it would perhaps be something like the relationship of an author to his or her characters. Where is Shakespeare in Hamlet? Where is Jane Austen in Pride and Prejudice? Well, the answer is everywhere and nowhere. The author is invisible, but he or she inhabits every line of the narrative. And so even Dawkins, I think, now is saying, well, maybe we can take deism as a kind of hypothesis for how the world came into existence. But you Christians, you believe all this rubbish the vicar tells you about the resurrection. To which I would say, well, getting to the God of the philosophers, as it's known, getting to the idea of a creator is not, it doesn't give you a full faith in Christ, of course not, but it's not negligible. I mean, it can perhaps get you to the threshold of where you might be willing to make some kind of venture, a venture of faith, or what I would prefer to call a venture of the imagination. And the Christian claim is that by listening to what Jesus says, by doing what he commands us to do, then one's whole vision of the world starts to change, and you start to see that God lives in Christ in an absolutely unique way. Can I prove that in a logically coercive way? No, I can't. But there's something about the knowing that is involved, that it's about your whole being. It's about heart as well as intellect. It's a bit like someone being asked, how do you know that your husband or wife loves you? Well, it's a different dimension of knowing, and I would hark back to Aristotle, who said in his Ethics, only a juvenile expects a model of certainty that corresponds to a mathematical model. There are other spheres of our knowledge that where, as I say, heart and emotions are in play, as well as intellect. And I like the line of one of my teachers at university who said, it's not reasonable to think that only reason discloses the world to us. It's reason allied to our ethical and aesthetic impulses. And if you do make that leap of imagination, I can see everything starting to come together. That is unlikely to come about first and foremost through a philosophical seminar. Being a Christian is about doing things that change you. People tend, on the whole, to live their way into a new way of thinking rather than think their way into a new way of living. And ultimately, of course, we are reliant on the grace of God enlightening our minds and hearts. If it weren't for the action of God, then there wouldn't be much point in having this conversation in the first place.
I love that, and I love that line. I've used it from you many times. We live our way into a new way of thinking rather than think our way into a new way of living. And I love that emphasis on imagination as well. It's a venture of imagination even more than it's a venture of faith. Do you think that's a little bit what Ayaan was getting at when she was on stage with Richard Dawkins and he was, firing questions at her? Do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? And she just said in such simple language, she said, well, Richard, let's think about she didn't use this language, but let's think about our metaphysics here. Let's think about our epistemology. You think there is nothing. I think there is something. And that actually what Ayaan was doing was pointing to, once you start from this foundation of the imagination, we are like Hamlet living in Shakespeare's world. Once you start with that, then something like a virgin birth becomes far less problematic than if you start with that there is nothing. That really two different imaginations were on show on that stage in New York.
Yes, I have indicated that as an atheist you are left with something of a lunar landscape. Metaphysically, Dawkins has said there is just DNA and we dance to its tune. Now what's curious is that at other times he talks very much as though meaning matters, and that meaning, not just that it matters, but it's something we discover as well as not something we invent. Now, the claim of the Christian, among other things, is that we can, belief in God provides a secure home for all these dimensions of our experience than just imagining, like, say, a Platonist, that the good, the true and the beautiful somehow subsist out there in a kind of blob in ways that we don't know. So belief in God is a valid principle, as I say, a valid inference of philosophical reasoning. And if this is a creation rather than a squillion to one accident, And if we're thinking in terms of enchantment, then everything that happens at all times ultimately is due to the grace of God. I mean, when I perform a trivial act like raise my arm, when I perform a morally more significant act like buy a meal for a homeless person, the classical tradition says, on the one hand, those are my free acts, but at a deeper level, they are the acts of God, because God, the divine energy, is bubbling up beneath the surface at all times. Now, a big mistake over the ages that Christians, let alone non-believers, have made is to think of creation as something that happened a very long time ago and then stopped. You know, God made something and put it on a shelf and went away. The correct way to understand things from a classical standpoint is that the relationship between God and creation is much more intimate. We can be chisels for the invisible hammer blows of God, to cite one of my favourite analogies. And I'll never forget another of my lecturers at university saying something which has stayed with me and really sort of changed my view of the world. And he said, you know, Christians believe that Jesus multiplied the loaves and the fishes at the feeding of the 5,000. But from a Christian standpoint, the power of God was also made manifest in the germination of the wheat in the first place. And I think that is a very, very good perspective from which to view things. When Rowan Williams, incidentally, was confronted by a heckler once, who said, you know, people don't rise from the dead, he said, very shrewdly, I think, given he only had a moment for a short answer, there is nothing in a Christian worldview to go against a mainstream understanding of cause and effect. But if you believe that underlying all of reality is the unconditioned action of God, then yes, you may be very surprised by reports of a resurrection, but you might not necessarily rule it out of court in principle.
Yes, and I think that's a lot of what Ayaan was getting at with, you know, I believe there is something. Because she had met something in opening herself up to God in times of great crisis, I believe there is something, you believe there is nothing. Therefore, we assess the evidence in different ways. Yeah, fascinating stuff. We've touched on so many areas that are covered in this book, the Eclipse of Christianity and Why It Matters. You've also written some other works that touch on some of the things that we've been speaking about, Rupert. If people want to take some next steps and hear more from you, what should they do? Where should they go? What should they read?
This was my 10th book. Over 20 years or so, I've produced a quartet of books, four brief ones, broadly connected with defending a belief in God in general and a Christian worldview in particular. We mentioned three of them already. God is no thing, that's subtitled Coherent Christianity. And it draws on a comment I once heard from a preacher, God is no thing but not nothing. So the pun, I think, works better in print than in speech. God is no thing, and then does religion do more harm than good? And then Outgrowing Dawkins, God for Grown-Ups, which is a rebuttal of Outgrowing God, a beginner's guide. And lastly, The Hardest Problem, God, Evil and Suffering. Before that, there were three biographical studies, two Rowan Williams, An Introduction, and Rowan's Rule, which is the main biography, and A Life of Benedict XVI, as I say. And then two freestanding works, Christianophobia, I've mentioned, A Faith Under Attack, and a more academic book called God's Advocates, in which I travelled round the English-speaking world and also parts of Europe and interviewed some leading Christian thinkers. And the book is edited transcripts of conversations with leading Christian theologians and philosophers of religion. And it's all about the remarkable recovery of nerve that has taken place in Christian thought in recent decades. And perhaps I should end just by pointing out that it is in the nature of an eclipse that it ends. And, we may be in the doldrums now, but I would be rash, I think, to make too firm a prediction about what may or may not happen in the future. The Church of England, as you know, in the 18th century was a pretty sorry institution. And what happened? We got the Methodist revival, other evangelical revivals, and religiously speaking, the 19th century was much more vibrant than the 18th. So you never know what God has in store around the corner.
Well, Rupert, you've been so very helpful and so generous with your time. You're an excellent writer and an absolute delight to read. And even though we come from different parts of the church and view things differently on lots of different matters, I have learnt so much from this book and really look forward to digging into those other ones as well, as I'm sure many will be. Rupert Shortt, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.